The No Nonsense Roundtable. It's a weekly show broadcast on Rochester, New York's 50,000-watt iHeart radio station, News Radio Wham 1180. The host, Dom Genova, interviews guests from all walks of life, all with amazing stories to tell. What you are about to hear is a recording of a previous broadcast without the breaks and commercials. Now, here's host Dom Genova.
Well, welcome everybody to another edition of No Nonsense Roundtable. We're here with, another one of the people I call a fan favorite, which is Bruce Pilato. Now, Bruce Pilato's been in the entertainment business for a long time. Actually, used to be my advertising rep when he was doing that for a living, and has a long and varied career. And I think you've met like everybody in the music business, or you've written about them or interviewed them. When you go to nononsenseroundtable.com, you can look at a YouTube, a 3-minute YouTube on a conversation he had with Ringo Starr. And before we go on any further, I would like to play that for you. It's about 3 minutes, and it has 49,000 views. This story about this interview he did. So we're going to take a second. We're going to listen to this for the next 3 minutes.
And it was Greg Lake, and he says, I got Ringo on the phone sitting next to me on the plane. He says, you know these people at Apple Computers, and he wants to get an Apple laptop. He doesn't own a computer. And I told him, you can put a whole recording studio in this little laptop. And he thought, maybe you could tell him what to buy and maybe arrange it for him. So he says, let me put him on. So he puts him on and he goes, hello, Bruce. And he goes, I want to get one of these Apple computers. And I said, okay. He says, well, Greg says you know people at Apple. And I said, well, I do. He goes, all right, well, tell him I want the same computer he's got with the studio in it and this and that. And I said, well, okay, I know what to get you. And he goes, all right, make sure you tell him, it's for Ringo. And, I don't want to pay for it. And I said, well,
he doesn't want to pay for it.
Yeah, I said, the only thing is, Ringo, is, they're expensive. I mean, back then, those laptops were like $5,800, yeah. Right? And I said, I don't know if they just give them out. I mean, he goes, well, you tell him it's for Ringo. And I say, well, I'll ask, but I can't guarantee I can get you one, and I can get you one. You won't have to wait 6 months like everybody else. I can get you one, but I don't know if I can get a free one. He goes, but I'm Ringo. And I said, yeah. He goes, oh, I'm just kidding. I'll pay for it. He goes,
oh, he got you.
Yeah, he got me.
He got you.
He goes, send it to my lawyer, Bruce Grickel, blah, blah, and this and that. And so anyways, I get a check. I paid for it on my credit card. I got him the computer. I get a check. And it's from Richard Starkey Productions, and it's signed by Ringo. And it was for the computer, which was like $6,000. And I said to my wife, I said, I don't want to cash this check.
Right, because it's signed, signed by Ringo. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is he's signed to Richard Starkey, which is his real name.
Oh, really?
Yeah. And she goes, it's $6,000. You're cashing the check. So, and I have plenty of Ringo autographs. So it's,
yeah.
But anyways, that's my Ringo story.
Yeah. So Ringo got you. That tells you Ringo heck of a sense of humor, right?
He had a great sense of the Beatles. I would have done the tour for free because just to hear the Beatles. I'm sitting there eating breakfast with him, and he's a vegetarian. He's eating whole grain cereal, and he goes, "Well, the day we did Day Trip, I remember that day." And it's like, are you kidding me? It's like they always say you're always disappointed when you meet your heroes. Nah.
So Bruce, that was absolutely fantastic, and we're expecting more of that stuff today.
Yeah, well, that was actually long after I had interviewed him. I was actually working on his tour at that time, and I was representing Greg Lake from the group Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and they brought me in to work on Ringo's tour, and I helped him put the band together and all that kind of stuff. And so I was kind of in a different capacity, but that's an absolute true story, and I've seen him a few times since. We've run into each other a lot at Grammy events and stuff, and he's always very gracious and always says hello to me and shakes my hand.
Now, your story is very interesting because you were working for Gannett, right?
I got out of Syracuse University, I went to the Newhouse School of Communications, and I wanted to be an entertainment journalist. They didn't have any openings. They said, look, if you want to work in advertising, we have a position for you, and you have an advertising background from school as well. Why don't you do that? You'll be out and about all day long, and, you can do your freelance writing or do whatever you want. So that's what I did. I did that for quite a while because the money was pretty decent, and I was able to develop my standing in the entertainment industry whenever I had time to do that. And then eventually I just made the transition. I went full time into that.
And you've worked for, you've had your articles published in Variety. And
Variety, USA Today, the Associated Press, Us Magazine. I've had about 1,600 articles and reviews published. I've done over 1,100 interviews. As you know, I've been working on a book, which my wife thinks that the Sistine Chapel could have been done in less time than I'm finishing my book. But I've made a decision to make the book into a trilogy. We're going to have, the book is called Feedback, One Man's Journey Through the History of Rock and Roll. And it'll be volume 1, 2, and 3, because when you've interviewed that many people, I mean, who do you leave out? I mean, do I leave out Celine Dion? Do I leave out Adele? Do I leave out, these legendary guys like the Stones? I mean, right now I've got 350 pages and I'm just about done with the first volume. So we'll see how that does. And if there's a demand for it, then obviously I can do the other two.
And you're a Rochester guy.
Yeah, well, that is the key to my success. I just did one of these TED speeches. It's a thing that's done all over the world where people give a speech about whatever they want to that's inspiring. And I talked about how I got this great career in this dream industry, and I managed to dodge a lot of bullets, and I did it all from upstate New York, which is hardly the entertainment center of the world. But what worked for me, and I've said this before, I think when I'm on the show, is that my dad was involved. He was an attorney, and he was also on the board of directors for the Rochester War Memorial, which has since become our Blue Cross Arena. And he would take me to all the shows, and over the years, I got to meet Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin and all these things. I'm like 12 years old, 13 years old. Started going to shows in 65, actually. And what was interesting was that I realized when I got out of college that none of the big tours ever opened in New York City or L.A., or London. They usually would play, they'd come here and they'd start in Buffalo, and then they go to Rochester, then they go to Syracuse, then they go to Albany, and then they would go to Madison Square Garden. And that was done for a reason, so that they could get the lighting cues right, the sound right, and they didn't want the first night of the tour to be in front of, the media, which was all in New York. So, I said, wow, I can cover all these cities. I can drive to Albany. I can drive to Buffalo. I can drive to Syracuse. And usually they would start in that area, which meant they got there 2-3 days before the tour started to set up, to rehearse, whatever. So, I'd be with Fleetwood Mac for a whole afternoon, or I'd be with, Peter Gabriel or whoever it was. And the other advantage I had is I got to these people before the New York people did. And I was able to, get those stories out in big magazines before they could pitch their stories.
I guess in the theater business, they call that you play Altoona first.
Yeah, exactly.
Before you hit Broadway.
Yeah.
And we're going to be talking more about your fascinating story right after this break. Well, welcome back. You're listening to the No Nonsense Roundtable. I'm here with Bruce Pilato. Bruce, what would you say your official title is? What do you call yourself?
Well, primarily I'm, an artist manager and an archivist, because I have that's still kind of what I do. I'm not a day-to-day journalist anymore, but I get asked to do a lot of archival projects and stuff like that. But I'm primarily an artist manager.
Well, there's like three things about you. One, you got this Forrest Gump thing going, where you've been there for all these different things. And one we're going to talk about is Little Richard. And then you are producing these shows like you are for Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and then talk about archivists. I mean, ladies and gentlemen, I was at this man's basement a few weeks ago, and talk about archivists. Oh my Lord, it's like a treasure trove of memorabilia, records, and stuff. Look at you smile. That's like your passion.
My kids say I'm just on the edge of being a hoarder. But no, it's all good stuff, and I'm hoping someday it'll be a museum, because it really is 50 years of amazing collecting and being there and experiencing all this. I mean, so I made the transition from journalism to, I worked in radio for a while. I produced a thing called the King Biscuit Flower Hour, which was a live radio broadcast. I went on to work on a bunch of different projects. People were always asking me to write liner notes, and I worked on these compilations and box sets, and I helped with licensing. And I just kind of got known as this guy. Well, he knows everybody. He's interviewed everybody. He should write the liner notes and all this kind of stuff. And then those artists that I worked with, starting with Emerson, Lake and Palmer was the first one. Many of them said, would you be interested in helping us in management? And that's how I got into that.
Well, give me another story. That last one on Ringo Starr was absolutely spectacular. Now, you have a story about Little Richard.
Yeah, I mean, people always ask me, what was the greatest interview you ever did? Well, I mean, I was lucky enough to interview 3 of the 4 Beatles, and that was phenomenal. And I've interviewed, really everybody from, Jerry Lee Lewis to Drake and Adele. But I would say the most memorable for me was I did 3 or 4 interviews with Little Richard, and then I worked on a TV show on the E! channel called the E! True Hollywood Story about Little Richard. And so I got to work with him quite a bit on that. But I did this one interview for a company called Persona, and we did it in Los Angeles. And I'm waiting for him to walk into the room. It was at Rogers and Cowan, who are one of the biggest agencies in the world for PR. In fact, they did Sinatra for years. And he walks in. I mean, he's dressed meticulously. He's got these black satin pants on and this shiny black jacket and a black shirt. And he had this incredible mane of hair with a little ponytail that went down his back, and he had makeup on, which he told me was Pancake 31. That's what it's called. He goes, it gives me a beautiful complexion, right? And then he had, mascara, and he just walked. He had these huge brown eyes, and he was actually kind of a short guy, but he had this big head, which is why they used to call him Little Richard, and that was back in the 50s. It was Little Walter, and, they had all these blues guys that were little in front of them. But anyways, he comes in, and the first thing he does is he goes to the mirror, and he's like playing with his hair. And he had this guy named Alan, who was his kind of his makeup guy and his valet. And Alan is like brushing off his suit and everything like that. And we were filming. That was part of the reason he was so meticulous about it. This was on video. And he looks in the mirror, and then he looks at me, and he goes, "The beauty is on duty." And it was like, okay, all right, I know what I'm dealing with here. And, I talked to him, and I would ask him a question. He was recording with John Bon Jovi at the time, and they did a song, and he was telling me all about it, how he's such a beautiful man. He's so handsome and blah, 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 blah. And I'm listening to him. And he goes, we did a song together. He goes, what's the name? And he stops the interview, and he looks at this guy, Alan. He goes, "Alan, what was the name of the song I did with John Bon Jovi?" It was like, it was called "You Really Got Me Now." He goes, "Oh, yes, it was called You Really Got Me Now." It's like, okay.
He forgot the name.
Yeah, so we have to
really
edit.
Got me now.
We have to edit that out. Okay, got it. I get it. But he told me fascinating stories. And people don't realize why he calls himself the architect of rock and roll. I mean, he put sex in rock and roll.
Yeah.
Okay. And, he had a lot of strikes going. He lived in the Deep South. He was African American. He was gay, but, couldn't come out of the closet. But most kind of people knew he was really flamboyant. And he said, we had to be really overtly gay looking, even if you weren't gay, because you couldn't perform in the clubs with white audiences because the men were afraid you'd go after their women. And it was just amazing. But he told me things like, when he was playing in the South, he'd have to play to a black audience in the afternoon, a white audience at night. He couldn't go through the backstage door. Him and the black guys in his band. He had a multiracial band. He had white guys and black guys in his band. The white people could go through the backstage door. The black individuals, including Little Richard, who was the star, had to go through the kitchen door. I mean, it was just amazing stuff. He was arrested a number of times for inciting a riot because the audiences were segregated, and the white kids would just come down and dance with the black kids. And it was an amazing, the stories he told me. And of course, the first professional gig the Beatles ever had was opening for Little Richard in England.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, yeah. And then, he fell in love with the Beatles, and they fell in love with him. And he tried to get them to come to America and get signed to his label because I think he wanted a piece of what they were about, and that didn't happen. But he remained close, especially with Paul McCartney. And when the Beatles used to do, She Loves You, yeah, 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 and they go woo. I mean, that was all Little Richard, all that kind of stuff, And it was amazing. And he said that they were just enamored with him, and he had great stories. I mean, the Rolling Stones opened for him. He said there was one night where Mick Jagger slept in his hotel room floor because they didn't have a place to stay. Just crazy stuff.
Now, this is all the stuff that behind the scenes stuff that people love to hear about. Now, you said there was he worked as a dishwasher for some time, and had a very, very aggressive boss, right?
Well, of course, if you listen to his music, you really hear the raw kind of raucous rock and roll, and most of those songs were recut by Elvis and Pat Boone, and they were homogenized because the radio was segregated back then. You couldn't get black artists on a lot of white pop stations. So if you listen to his version of Tutti Frutti and you listen to Pat Boone's version, it's like, Pat Boone sounds like a milk-fed puppy, and Little Richard really goes at it. But
no, I have a revelation here. So hence Elvis's popularity because he was a white guy singing it in a black.
He was a white guy that sounded black.
Right. And so he could be on the white station.
The first time Elvis Presley ever appeared on television, he sang Tutti Frutti. And
Really?
Of course, the beginning of that song was the famous, womp babaloom bam bam boom.
Uh-huh.
And the story behind that, and when Little Richard was trying to make a career in music, he was working as a dishwasher in a Greyhound bus station in Macon, Georgia, a very racially segregated situation. He had a white guy that was for a boss that was very abusive, used to come in there and give him a hard time about everything, especially if there was a speck of food on any of the dishes he was washing. And he would just be very demeaning and racist and say the N word and all this kind of stuff. And then he'd walk out of the kitchen and go back into his office. And back then, what Little Richard really wanted to do was say F you and blah, 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 and really give it to the guy. But he couldn't do that because he knew he'd be lynched or something if he did that. So he used to go back to washing the dishes, and he'd slam the pots into the water, and he'd go womp babaloo babala bam boom. That was his way of saying, why don't you go F yourself, And the bottom line is that became this iconic phrase that really launched the rock and roll movement.
Yeah. And we're about ready to head into a break, but Tutti Frutti was actually something booty or whatever. We won't go too deep.
Yeah, I don't know if I can say the original lyrics is Tutti Frutti, it's real good booty, and all these other phrases. So they brought in a woman, and she co-wrote it with him and toned it down.
Well, we're about ready to head into that break, and we'll see you on the other end. Well, welcome back. You're listening to the No Nonsense Roundtable, and we're talking to Bruce Pilato, who is a Rochester guy, highly involved in the music business and so many different things. I said before the break that it's sort of like this Forrest Gump thing. You've been all these places, and who knew? And it's just fantastic. What a life you've lived.
Well, I got two experiences of legitimacy. My dad was a very successful attorney, and I have a lot of lawyers in my family. I had an uncle who was a judge, and I started writing for the American Bar Association Journal. I wrote a story on the Beatle lawsuits, And so that was when my father knew I made it. Actually, I thought USA Today and Variety was a much bigger situation, but he was, my son wrote for the ABA Journal.
Everybody's got their thing, I guess.
Yeah, and then about 10 years ago, I started teaching at the University of Rochester and Nazareth College. I teach different courses, and I can only teach one day a week because I travel so much, but I love that. That's been great to talk to these. What's so interesting is that a lot of my students now, I'll talk about stuff going on about the Beatles or Fleetwood Mac or whatever, and they have no clue who I'm talking about, especially the exchange students. If I have an exchange student from China, they've heard of the Beatles, but they don't know anything about
it. It goes beyond music. I remember talking to one of my salespeople at the dealership once. I said, you realize that Captain Kirk only had a flip phone, right? And he goes to me, who's Captain Kirk? And I'm like, oh my God, yeah. So let's talk about the latest project that you have coming up with Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Yes,
I am like a raging fan of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. As a matter of fact, my favorite album is Trilogy.
Yeah, beautiful record. I got asked to work on their box set, and I had interviewed them a bunch of times as a journalist, and I hit it off with Greg Lake, who was the singer and guitarist, bass player. And he asked me to get involved with the band, and they had a manager named Stuart Young who's still involved with them, who goes back to the early 70s, but they didn't have anybody in America. So he said, why don't you work on my career and I'll get you involved with the LP. So I've been involved with them since like 92, 93. And of course we lost Keith and Greg. They both died in the same year in 2016. They died about 8 months apart, and Greg had pancreatic cancer, and Keith had other ailments. But I had been involved with Carl, the drummer, and I had become his personal manager as well as helping oversee the archives. Anyways, we got approached. Carl had been going out with a group called the ELP Legacy. Of course, I also work with his other group, Asia, which sold 15 million records, and he had both things going. And we got approached by a company to do a hologram tour with the two guys that had passed away. And that was a kind of a rage a few years ago. They did a Buddy Holly one, and, I saw the Frank Zappa one, and they did one with Whitney Houston. And we saw some of these shows, and they just didn't feel right. They feel kind of creepy, and it was like this misty imagery in the middle of the stage. It wasn't really real. It didn't look like it was real. Mm-hmm. And they used to get like an actor or an actress to play that person, and then they would slap the face of the real person on them, and that's kind of how it worked. And then, of course, the kicker was we sat down with them, and they wanted $600,000 to create 2 working holograms. Plus, they were limited. They could only move about 2 feet in either direction. And I said to Carl, I said, you know what? We're never going to make any money if you got to spend that much just to get it off the ground. I said, why don't we look at what we have? Because ELP was very smart. They had great business people, and they own everything. They own their record library. They own their publishing. They owned all their videos, and they controlled everything. Very similar to what the Beatles did when they formed Apple. And I said, look, there's this show from the Royal Albert Hall that came out, right? Mm-hmm. And the band had just gotten back together. They were in their prime. They look good. They sound good. That company that put it out got bought by Universal right after it came out, and Universal stopped promoting any of the current releases and just wanted to put new stuff out. So not many people saw it. It was one of the few ELP records that didn't sell a lot, the DVD rather. So we got that, and we looked into it, and we checked with the archives in England, and we found out that we had all the cameras. We had all multi-track audio, which meant I had Greg Lake's voice on a separate track. I had Keith Emerson's keyboard. And I said, why can't we put these on 3 video walls? And we'll just take you out of the video. So we re-edited the video and took every shot of Carl Palmer out of it, so that all you see on the screens are Keith Emerson and Greg Lake. And Carl's live on the stage with 2 other musicians that he's been working with. And they don't play on everything, but they add some meat to the sound on a few things. So having 5 people there's a little bit better. And we call it the return of Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And of course, the best thing that happened to us was the pandemic.
Really?
Yeah, because it gave us 2 years to develop this, to clear all the legal hurdles. We had to negotiate with the two families because we wanted to call it Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and we couldn't do that.
Right.
We couldn't use their pictures or anything without making sure they got a piece of it. So we negotiated a deal. They get paid on every show. They get paid on the merchandise. And we can go out with this show. And it's really doing phenomenal. It's getting great reviews. And we go out, when we do outdoors, we use video walls, which are digital. But inside, we've been using this new technology, which is on collapsible screens, using projectors that use lasers. And it's actually better than the video walls because the video walls are still pixelated. So if you're really close, it doesn't look quite as natural. This thing here, it's like they're right in front of you. And because we can isolate their sounds and bring the keyboard up or the voice down or whatever we have to do, it's just like them being on the stage. So we've done about 30, we've done about 24 shows so far. We're going to do another 6 in November, and then we're going to take it around the world.
Wow. And you're having a show here.
Yes, we are.
Well, let's talk about that.
It's going to be November 3rd. It's going to be at the Theater at Innovative Square, which is in the old Xerox Tower building, the white Xerox Tower that's right in the middle of downtown. They have a beautiful 700-seat theater in there. And if I can give it a plug, you can get, there's still some tickets left, and you can go to elptickets.com, elptickets.com, and there's still some great seats left. And you will see a show that you will not forget.
And what was that again?
elptickets.com.
Trying to help you out, buddy.
Well, you know what happens is that every show's got a different link, right? And for Carl to go around and do interviews, depending on what city it is, he has so I said, why don't we do this? I'm going to register that name. So I did. I registered elptickets.com, and that goes to one page where all the ticket links are.
I love the idea. I mean, because sometimes it's so hard to get Ticketmaster and stuff.
Yeah.
But ELP, and that is a great theater. I saw Garth Fagan there a while back, and it's beautiful. I mean, it's a great place. I think a lot of people haven't been there yet.
No, well, it's been a private theater, and then when Xerox moved out, 2 gentlemen came in and worked on it. A guy named Carl Stabu, who's kind of running it, and he was also part of the Jazz Fest. And they put quite a bit of money into it. Gorgeous theater.
And right after this, we're going to be talking about, well, your basement.
Well, yeah.
Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. We're so glad you could attend. Come inside, come inside.
Well, welcome back. You're listening to the No Nonsense Roundtable. We're talking to, well, a good friend of mine, too, Bruce Pilato, who's been in the entertainment business for a long time, has a show that he is, what you say, you're producing the show, right? I mean,
well, I manage the artist. Primarily,
yeah.
I came up with the concept with him. But like I said before in the last segment, we morphed it from the idea of being a hologram thing to something that was more genuine, because it really is Greg Lake singing and Carl Palmer on drums and Keith Emerson playing the keyboard. So for those people who never got to see ELP, this is the closest thing that you could get to a reunion of the band.
I love Emerson, Lake and Palmer. You say they're going to be here in
November
a couple of weeks.
3rd.
Yeah. Okay, great.
Yeah. So,
do you think I might be able to get an interview with?
Carl likes to talk to intelligent people. As long as that.
Okay, you could tell me very easily I'm out of luck.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to lie for you, but yeah, we'll try to get him on your show.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it would be great. I mean, you would say what? 50 million albums they've sold?
Yeah, Emerson, Lake and Palmer sold about 50 million, and then they took a break, late 70s. Whoa. And then he got a call from David Geffen of Geffen Records. Yeah. And he said, well, we like all the musicianship with the prog rock, because that's what they were known for. They used to, they were different because they were blues based or rock and roll based. They were English classically based. I mean, Keith Emerson went to the Royal Academy of Music and all that kind of stuff. So they, they were European. And then, of course, they used to blend it with the acoustic stuff like Lucky Man and Still You Turn Me On. So they were really quite different. But they were really one of the first groups to have the big, extravagant shows, spinning pianos and all that kind of stuff. So they're going to be here, and unfortunately, they took a break at the end of the 70s, and then David Geffen called and said, "Well, I got one guy from King Crimson, one guy from Yes, one guy from a group called the Buggles who wrote a song called Video Killed the Radio Star, and we're putting a supergroup together." And Carl was asked to be the drummer. So they were the first supergroup of prog guys, but they were fashioned as a top 40 pop band because Asia was a top 4. They went to number 1 right away. They were number 1 for 9 weeks on the first album, which is really, I think it's something like within the 10 biggest records of all time for any particular year. And he had that run for a few years, and then eventually they all went back to their other bands, and ELP got back together in the 90s. And then after that, they kind of splintered again, and Carl's been off doing his own thing with his own trio. And this is the first time we've been able to reunite it. And unfortunately, we lost the other two, but they're very much alive on that stage.
Well, the other thing about the band is that, you see, they weave some classical music into the repertoire. I mean, what was it? Aaron Copland stuff.
Fanfare for the Common Man.
Fanfare for the Common Man.
Hoedown.
Hoedown, yeah.
Yeah, but here's the funny part.
What?
They did a recording when they were in music school together, and both Emerson and Palmer had to play this thing called Pictures in an Exhibition by Migorsky.
Yeah, I remember that.
Famous piece of classical music. And they did a rock version of it, and they recorded it. They did it as a concert, and they recorded the concert. And they said, this is going to be our third album after Tarkus and before Trilogy. We want to put this album out called Pictures in an Exhibition. But we made it in one night, so what we'd like it to be is a discount record, maybe a couple dollars cheaper than what you would normally pay for an album. We just want to get the music out there. And Atlantic Records, who was their label in America, said no. No kid is going to want to listen to classical music, even if it's played by a rock band. This is too gender bending. You just can't do it, okay? So they rejected the album. They then went to their British label, which was Island Records, and they said, oh, God, we love this. This is great. They put it out. It sold 4 million copies, and it came into America as an import and sold 50,000 copies in 1 week. Guess who came knocking again?
Atlanta.
Yeah. You know that record you guys got? We've changed our mind. We want to put it out. Yeah, so it is now probably the largest selling album of a classical piece of work by a rock band.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm going out on a limb here. Wasn't Atlantic the label for the Rascals?
Yeah, they were the greatest American label, in my opinion, for many, many years. They had Led Zeppelin. They had the Rascals. They had Cream and all the Clapton stuff. They had done all the great soul music like Sam and Dave, and Aretha Franklin was on Atlantic. I mean, just their roster, it was Ahmet Ertegun. It was just, their roster was fabulous. And they signed a lot of the British bands like King Crimson, Yes, ELP, but they didn't think there was long history in progressive music, which is why ELP was able to get their catalog back. And they made a big mistake, because that catalog has been resold many, many, many times, and it has been reissued many, many times, and it's still selling a ton of records.
It's surprising to me. Maybe I don't know enough about the business, but they would go out on a limb for the Rascals, but not for Pictures in the Exhibition.
Well, the Rascals had 17 top 40 hits. I mean, they were a great band. And to be honest with you, ELP was more of a concert band.
A little more cerebral, you would say?
Much more cerebral.
Yeah. Okay.
But they always had that hit single in there. They always had a Lucky Man, or Still You Turn Me On, or Welcome Back, My Friends, to the show that never ends. So they had quite a few radio hits.
And so there's a difference in culture between the United States and I mean, we went through this thing where everything British was great, right?
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people still feel that way. But the funny thing of it is the British owe everything to the early pioneers of rock and roll, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, all that. I mean, there wouldn't be a Rolling Stones if it wasn't for those people. There wouldn't be a Led Zeppelin if it wasn't for the American blues guys like Willie Dixon and Muddy Waters and guys like that.
Yeah, well, who first recorded Roll Over Beethoven?
Chuck Berry.
And that was sung by the Beatles.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They had, I mean, the Beatles did a lot of covers in the beginning, but because it was unheard of for bands to write their own material. There's a phrase in the music industry that the guy who was in charge of discovered the talent and everything was called the A&R guy. Do you know what A&R stands for?
No.
Artists and Repertoire.
Okay.
And what that means is, here's the artist, here's the repertoire. I'm going to find the right songs for the artists that I just signed. Well, the Beatles came along and said, excuse me, we have our own songs. That was really unheard of.
Yeah. So we have about a minute and a half, maybe 2 minutes left, and let's pitch your show a little bit more. I think you'll agree with that. That's
yeah, well,
idea.
I work with a lot of groups. I work with a group called the Vanilla Fudge, who were also on Atlantic Records, and I work with a great 80s blues rock guy called Pat Travers Band. But, the ELP stuff is special to me. It was music I really loved as a kid, and to be able to be working with these people, and not just Carl. I worked with all of them when they were together. Mm-hmm. It was a great thrill. But this show is fascinating because what it does is it combines the best of technology and everything. And what's interesting now is, and I'll make this quick, but the AI controversy,
Mm-hmm.
Artificial intelligence, you can go into a recording that is not separated by separate tracks of audio, and you can create separate tracks of audio. You can just pull the vocal out of a record. You can just pull the bass line out of a record. And that's going to enable people to do more of what we're doing. We're the first band to do this. Other people have sung with an artist on a film, but nobody's done it a whole show, a whole concert. And, where they brought back a band that's no longer here.
That's amazing. It really is. I remember talking to Gene Cornish about, I guess the thing was 6-track or 8-track was a big deal back then, and they were able to record on Atlantic, and the Beatles too. They say that was a big thing.
The Beatles recorded Sgt. Pepper on 4 tracks of audio.
4 tracks, can you imagine?
Yeah, so what they would do is they would record on 3 tracks and bounce it down to 1, and then they record on another 2 tracks and bounce that down to 1, and then. If you listen to the early Beatle records in stereo, it's Paul McCartney and the bass is in one channel, and the rest of the Beatles are in the left, the other channel.
Well, Bruce, great having you on again. Give us the web address of tickets for
if you want to go to the ELP show, it's November 3rd at the theater at Innovative Square, and you can get tickets at elptickets.com.
And I will be there.
We will see you there.
We will see you there. Okay, gang, No Nonsense Roundtable, 10 a.m. right here every Saturday. Thanks.
Thanks for listening. Tune in every weekend from 10 to 11 on News Radio Wham 1180. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll make more.